So I'm going to cover the Manx elections of 2021. Thank you very much for coming along tonight. I think being online is a particularly good idea at the moment. Certainly I wouldn't particularly fancy venturing out the Oxford version. So just to give a bit of context for this work, I'm part of a team which is looking at women in Manx politics, which includes Katrina, who's here tonight. And with generous support from Trovanin, we're looking at women in Manx politics with a particular emphasis on the 21st century. It's a multidisciplinary project. We're going to be looking at things from the perspective of law, history, and sort of broader cultural and textual studies. So it actually brings together colleagues from Brookes, UCM, and Edgehill. So we have here our project logo and a link onto the project. As I've said, our emphasis is on the 21st century, and the project formally starts in January when we're hoping to begin the process of really drilling down and talking to people about their experiences. But as part of the run-up to that, I've been looking at the history of women in Manx politics, which inevitably involves the history of Manx politics more broadly. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put into a broader historical perspective the general election to the House of Keys, which will involve considering elections to the House of Keys historically, the by-elections to Legislative Council, which will involve the same. And that's going to mean that I'll be thinking more broadly about party politics in the Isle of Man, the link between the Keys and the Council, and women in Manx politics. Now, what I'm going to be saying tonight is drawing on research I've been doing in preparation for this joint research project, but I should stress that the views are entirely my own. So just a quick reminder of what the elections were. There was a general election to the House of Keys, regular general election, all 24 seats in play, across 12 two-member constituencies, very wide electorate, so it is, the public ballot. There were limited changes to accommodate the pandemic, particularly changes to the rules around proxy votes, which I think were very useful. It was ran on the 23rd of September 2021. It was observed by the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, who's just reported on it formally with their final report. Generally positive, some issues which I think there is a political will to explore going forward. Now, that was, if you like, the big election. Additionally, there were two by-elections. There was a by-election to the Legislative Council requiring filling 2 seats, and 2 seats needed to be filled as 2 MLCs had successfully been elected as MHKs. Not unprecedented, but unusual in some ways. The electorate, as normal, was the members of the House of Keys, which included the 2 former MLCs. And the vote, as since 2017, was by open ballot, with each MHK being able to vote twice and 13 votes needed for election. So you have the general election for the MHKs, which is a public ballot, and then you have these this by-election of 2 seats to the Legislative Council, which is a very small electorate indeed. It's the Keys themselves. So I'm going to start by my reflections on the elections to the House of Keys, and I've got three things to explore really. The first one is how much competition to be elected to the House of Keys. I've broken this down into 3 periods. Now, there's a particular technical reason for that. 1919 to 1985, we had first past the post election. So you ballot, and the people you get 1 vote per seat to be filled, and the people who get the most votes get their seats. In the 1991 elections, on the other hand, it was actually done under a form of single transferable vote, a different voting system, which was contentious even when it was introduced, was not popular, and was rejected surprisingly quickly. So in 1996, to the date, we've gone back to the first past the post, which you would recognise from Westminster elections. If we look at these, the competitiveness, what's interesting to me is that there has been a decline in the percentage of seats in the House of Keys where there was no competition. If only 1 candidate stands for a seat and they're eligible, they will take the seat without having to run a formal poll of any sort. Unopposed elections were always comparatively uncommon, increasingly uncommon with the passage of time, and actually there hasn't been one since in the last 3 general elections. So we're seeing increased competition in terms of the number of seats where there is a genuine competition taking place. Additionally, if you look at the second column in my chart, the chances of being elected have fluctuated over the years. So the black bar, it starts off at near the 50%. Pretty much half of the candidates for the keys in this period were actually elected. So a 50-50 chance of getting a seat. Notable drop during the single transferable vote period. And although it's increased since then, it still hasn't gone up to the 50%. And then my third bar is the percentage of candidates who were women. And what's really striking is the radical increase here as we go on to the third period, 1996 on. In particular, the 3 general elections since 2011 were contested by 36 women, the same number as contested the 12 general elections from 1919 to 1981. So a radical transformation in the number of women running to become a member of the Keys. Far more women were running from 1996 in particular, which has led to a gradual increase in the number of women MHKs up until a historic increase in women elected in 2021, which is my next slide. There are now as many women in the Keys at one time as were elected at any point from 1918, when women first became eligible, to the general election in 1976. So the entire period, 1919-19, only gives you the same number of women as you actually see in this photo here, who are all sitting MHKs today. 10, that's twice as many sitting at any one time as the previous record, which was set in December 1974 and then matched in 2016. So a really radical transformation, which is obviously fantastic news for us as researchers, as it gives us something really exciting to look into in terms of the 21st century experience of women in Manx politics. Now, my third thing to touch upon is the role of party politics in the Isle of Man. It's frequently said that the Isle of Man, the Isle of Man is politics without parties. And one of the things I want to do is to really drill down into that a little bit and look in a more comprehensive way at how parties are functioned in Keys general elections. Again, I've broken it down into 3 periods. So 1919 to the introduction of single transferable vote period, and since the return to first past the post. I was really interested when I was putting the data together on this peak, which you can see immediately post-war. This is the closest the Isle of Man came to a situation where some form of party affiliation was actually the dominant model of a candidate for the Keys. That's obviously some distance away from a 2-party system. The peak in 46 and 51 is actually a whole bunch of parties, some of which are quite short-lived. But it's interesting to me that after the massive dislocation of World War II, you have party politics really taking quite a big role in election to the Keys, and then it's fading away. And you can see that the number of non-party independent candidates is increasing. And I've said already that the competition for seats is more intense, but the number of party drops continuously. This is probably the most boring slide I've ever shown anybody. These are the 2 single transferable vote parties. As you can see, lots of independent candidates standing, very few party candidates, and actually dropping between the 2 elections. And then slightly more interestingly, 1996 to date, modest increase in the role of candidates affiliated with the party, but nothing approaching post-war elections. There were a large number of parties, consisting of a number of different parties at various times, which between them fielded largely the same number of candidates as in the STV elections, but in a context where fewer independent candidates were standing. So the common statement that the Isle of Man is not dominated by formal political parties is obviously borne out by this. I think there's some interesting things to look at immediately post-war, what was happening there. And I would just like to highlight one party, because even in the Manx context where parties were not dominant, the distinctive contribution of the Manx Labour Party is worth highlighting. It's the only party which has contested every general election since 1919. And if we aggregate the candidates coming forward across all general elections since 1919, there's 127 times a candidate has stood for the Manx Labour Party, from a total of 228 times for any party. Thus, Manx Labour Party candidates constitute 55% of all party candidates. So more than half of the people who have stood for the keys with a party affiliation have been Manx Labour Party. So I think that's interesting. So this is where I get a bit more speculative, because the numbers don't really justify me being very, very confident, but I think they're still interesting. So one of the things I was curious about was how far does party affiliation play out in terms of the likelihood of a candidate being elected, the likelihood of a woman standing for a seat, and to combine the two, the likelihood of a woman candidate being elected but affiliated with the party, as opposed to when standing as an independent. Again, I've divided the general election into these three periods. And you can see the percentage for these different categories. Now, we need to be really cautious about this, because even when I aggregate the multiple elections, we're still talking about very small numbers in many cases. So the most I'm going to say, particularly as I'm being recorded, is that this is suggestive of a relatively close success rate between independent and party candidates, except during the STV period. So it doesn't feel like independents are labouring under a significant disadvantage, which obviously when you look at a system where the parties are more dominant, actually works differently. And there may be some interesting things about small democracies and the intimacy of the small democracy political system, which is relevant here. There's a similar success rate post-85 for women candidates as compared with men standing in the general election. Women were actually much more successful in the most recent election, but if you look at the numbers across the three, it's very, very similar. There is possibly something interesting happening around women standing for a party being more likely to be elected than independents generally. On the last point, I've suggested that the Manx Labour Party was an unusual party in Manx terms, contesting every general election, more than half of all party candidates. With my usual caveat about the very small numbers involved, this is slightly more pronounced when we look at women candidates in parties. 22 women stood as party candidates, 14 of whom were Manx Labour Party. So the Manx Labour Party has fielded 55% of candidates generally, but 64% of women party candidates. And it may be, if you look at the bottom right, which is 1992 to 2021, percentage success women party candidates, it may be that there's something useful and interesting about women and party politics in the Isle of Man, because you're seeing quite a big difference there between the success of women generally and the success of women party candidates. But as I say, the numbers are so small, we have to be really, really cautious. And one of the things that our full project is going to do is to take this as a sort of a starting point and inspiration, and really get involved in the qualitative work, asking, what the experience was of people going through these. So I'm about to move to the council, but I think, Gail, we were going to deal with any points of clarification, if people had any.
Yes, if anyone's got it. There's nothing in the chat. There's nothing in the chat box as we speak, but if there are any immediate questions or comments or clarifications around the data that Peter's presented, it might be useful to ask it now before we move on to the next section. So here's your chance. A few more seconds. Okay, you've clearly presented it well. Oh, hang on, no, Michael's just got in. You see that one there about data point labels on the charts?
Yes. There is there's two different explanations for the lack of data point labels. One of them is the charts were looking a bit packed. The other one is, having successfully used some data point labels, I then entirely forgot how to do it on PowerPoint as normal software. But yeah, there's certainly a fuller version which will be appearing as part of our project. I will be a bit clearer on the data points. Thank you very much. Yeah, I could definitely do with it at this point in 2021. My technical skills have been interestingly challenged this year.
Good for you. Okay, thanks, Michael. Okay, I think if unless anyone doesn't look like we've got any more clarification questions, Peter, so we'll
okay.
crack on.
So those really were my reflections on the keys. And I anticipated that being the most interesting bit of my background work, but actually I found myself getting completely obsessively interested in the Legislative Council. So my next three comments are really going to be about the Legislative Council. Obviously, the second chamber in Manx politics, not the dominant democratically elected chamber. Since 1961, it's had a seriously subsidiary role, which has just been reduced really over the years, but still very interesting. So I've mentioned that unlike the Keys, which are in my period to some extent democratically elected, and we could argue about that, in the council, the election was by the Keys. They decide who sits in Tynwald with them in the Legislative Council. My first point on the Legislative Council elections, let's wait this to work. It feels to me that there has been order from chaos, and the chaos is absolutely fantastic. It was really surprising to me throughout the period. So I have things in my working life which I have to do once a year. And sometimes once a year is just too long for me to remember exactly how to do them. So I get a bit confused. The Legislative Council elections were typically once every 3 or 4 years. And there are definitely times when the Keys just did not remember or work out what they should be doing. So some high points from the chaos for me. 1954, there was multiple rounds of election. So they couldn't get the majority of 13 MHKs needed to appoint to a seat. And so they had multiple rounds. And the Speaker refused to tell the Keys how many votes each candidate had got in the previous round in case it prejudiced them against some candidates, which I think is pretty astonishing, really. In 1958, the Speaker, again wrestling with multiple rounds trying to fill a seat, suggested, I think on the hoof, a process that would have taken the 4 candidates, eliminated the candidate who was closest to having 13 votes, and then had a poll between the 3 surviving candidates. So that is very odd. 1962, the Speaker basically threw his hands in the air saying, look, we've got precedents on this. They're in complete contradiction to each other. It's a complete dog's breakfast. It wasn't, however, a sufficiently bad dog's breakfast to be unlawful. That was 1970, when the Speaker had to go back to the Keys, apologise profusely and say, look, I know we did this election a few weeks ago. It was actually illegal. It was contrary to the statute. So we're going to have to do it again. What wasn't necessarily contrary to the statute, but was certainly contrary to the status, was that also in 1970, in an earlier round of voting, an MHK had been elected to go into the MLC. The Speaker then said that they had immediately become an MLC and had immediately ceased to be an MHK and couldn't vote in future rounds of the voting. And that also was contrary to statute, although not justiciable necessarily. So those are really quite exciting chaos. And then after that, really the chaos is just repetitive and time-consuming failure to make decisions. So in 1987, 8 rounds of voting, 1990, 12 rounds of voting, 1998, 5 sittings spread over 3 months to give lots of time for negotiation to fill 4 seats. 2003, 5 sittings over 4 months. 2005, 4 sittings over 2 months, including my personal favourite, which was a sitting with just 1 candidate who was not elected. 2007, 8 sittings over 5 months. 2010, 19 rounds of voting. 2015, 20 rounds of voting. There was an attempt to bring order from this, and you find some really interesting discussions in Tynwald that not only is this a really unproductive way of using parliamentary time, but that it's actually bringing the process into disrepute. And so you in some of the earlier ones, you have the speakers defending what's being done. This is being misrepresented as chaos. And then later on, the speakers are basically saying, look, come on, folks, we should be doing better. So from the 1980s, the process has been clarified. You don't get as much confusion, but you do still get deadlocks and rejection of the only candidate. There was a move towards more consistent information being given to candidates before the debate. In the early years, it's a very ad hoc process. Doesn't seem to have made much difference. What I feel did make a difference was that in 2017, there was a reform of the process which included removal of the secret ballot. Now, up until 2017, the MHKs voted, but they voted by secret ballot. So an MHK could quite legitimately say to somebody, I'm going to back you in this vote, and then cast their vote for a different candidate. And there's a number of jokey references and acceptance speeches from various MLCs on that. You also find some tactical suggestions of voting. So there's one round I can recall where a candidate was proposed and nominated and didn't get neither person voted. They got literally no votes. So they've been put forward into the competition by an MHK proposing them and an MHK seconding them. Neither of them voted for them. 2017, we've moved to removal of the secret ballot. There's a few other changes as well, but that's the one I want to focus on. And since 2017, every MLC seat has been filled in a single round of voting. So it's really a profound transformation from the earlier 21st century stuff. I think it may have been that the open ballot led to a more straightforward set of voting plans by MHKs. There were games that they could play behind a secret ballot, which they couldn't play when their votes were recorded, not only for other MHKs to see, but also for the public to see. Another possibility is that we also see a shift around about the same time to non-MHK candidates. So it may be because they weren't faced with making votes for somebody that they would still be working with in Tynwald, either as an MHK or an MLC, that again, some of this game playing didn't happen. So I'm going to move on to that point now about the shift to MHK candidates.
Peter, I might break my own rule here because there's a question coming on the chat asking, was that removal in 2017 something to do with the Liz Vane recommendation?
Liz Vane had reservations about the process, and he actually proposed a radical transformation, which didn't happen. But in fairness to Tynwald had already thought, actually, this is not working out at all. And so there'd already been a process set up before Liz Vane to explore this. And that was how the end of the secret ballot came about. As I recall, the actual recommendation was to keep the secret ballot, make various other changes to keep the secret ballot. But the committee, so that was a committee recommendation. But actually, when it came to Tynwald rejected that. There were a lot of individuals who said, look, appointing somebody to be an MLC is a key function for us as MHKs, and we should be accountable to the electorate for the decisions we make, so there should be an open ballot.
Great.
So, another chart. This one I seem to have got at least some tags. So, I've done it by decades here. We don't have general elections in the same way necessarily, and the decades gives, I think, enough information to say something meaningful. So you've got the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010, 2020s. The far left bar is people who had been elected to Tynwald having sat in Tynwald previously. So this is sitting MLCs, MHKs. There's a few ex-MHKs, ex-MLCs, but that's the overwhelming majority. So people already in Tynwald, staying in Tynwald by being an MLC. So the blue on the far left is the percentage of people who are elected. The black is the percentage who are candidates. And the first thing to point out is in the 60s and 70s, everybody who became an MLC was either a sitting MLC or an MHK, or had previously been in Tynwald. And this is what you see all the way back to 1919, okay? So the idea that MLCs were former MHKs, absolutely justified by the data at this point. Now, the 1980s, we start to see some interesting things happening. We start to see, if you look at the 80s columns, the lone blue one on the right is candidates who are put forward who had not already sat in Tynwald, and we start to see them. Now, in the 80s, we start to see them in the context of short-term by-elections. So an MLC dies, or more rarely resigns, and you've only got a short period, perhaps 5 or 6 months, left running on their membership in Tynwald. MHKs who may have 3 or 4 years sitting as MHKs are really obviously reluctant to give up that time in Tynwald to take a short-term by-election. There are some really odd solutions to this earlier on. But by the 1990s, you start to see in by-elections all non-MHK slates coming forward for these very short periods. But then in 2000, you start to get candidates being put forward who aren't MHKs for normal MLC seats, and you start to get non-MHKs starting to be elected. And that's the bit filling between the black and the far blue. And then 2010, we see this accelerating. Again, more candidates coming forward than elected, but it's starting to build. And then 2020s, you actually have this really quite radical transformation where MHKs are selecting MLCs from outside of Tynwald, severing the link between being an MHK and being an MLC. Now, why? I think that it's really an erosion of two themes, which had earlier been used to justify MHK MLC. If you're interested in this, I would really recommend going on to Tynwald Hansard, House of Keys, and read the debates for the first ever MLC elections, because they are really striking. You find the argument is that the democratic impetus, the democratic change to the Manx Constitution, requires us to appoint MHKs to become members of the Legislative Council. And the argument here, which is strongest in 1919, starts to fade as you get towards the modern day, is that the council is dominated by them, the imperial officials, the Deemsters, the Attorney General, the Bishop, individuals who are part of the imperial establishment. And in 1919, although MLCs elected by the Keys were introduced, the governor was also given the power to appoint individuals themselves. So there was very much a very strong theme in 1919, which you see repeatedly, not really petering out until quite late, as late as 2010 actually, that the MLCs should be loyal partisans of the Keys, and that by being supporters of the Keys, they are representing the democratic element in the Manx Constitution, and that the best way to make sure that the MLC is a loyal partisan of the Keys is to appoint an MHK well known to the House. We find this really strongly in 1919. There are some later references, and the latest that I think is strong is the proposal of Mrs. Cannell in 2010, saying she still has a political mandate for the people of East Douglas given to her at the last general election. So there is this idea that by appointing people who have been elected as MHKs, you are seeping a democratic element into the MLC process. Additionally, well, sorry, let me go back to this first point. Now, what changed? I think what changed is that after 1961, the council is not necessarily seen as the enemy of the Keys in quite the way. There are tensions, there remain tensions, but as power shifts to the Keys, the need to have a Keys partisan defending the Keys in the council gets less and less. And instead, we find a gradually emerging, but still not necessarily entirely clear, understanding that the council is not meant to be an alternative House of Keys. It has a special role in relation to scrutiny of legislation. And so you find candidates being recommended not because they are loyal partisans of the Keys, but because they will be really good scrutineers of prospective legislation. They will have technical or legal or policy expertise, which will really add to the capacity of Tynwald. So loyalty to the Keys ceases to be a dominant theme, and therefore the idea that you appoint an MHK in order to make sure they are loyal drops away. The other theme that I found that was quite interesting was that the idea that being an MLC was a reward for contribution to the life of Tynwald and a form of semi-retirement. So this suggestion that you know, somebody who served a long time as an MHK, they have earned their elevation, a little bit like they do being elevated in the House of Lords. And although they no longer feel quite up physically to the demands of being an MHK, the demands of being an MLC are so much less that they will be able to make those. This also dropped away. the last flick of it to me is in 1978. This was interesting because the MLC competition would mean that somebody who was successful would be in Tynwald for millennium. And this was obviously a really big thing. So Mr. Cameen noted the demands of Tynwald and suggested that regard should be given to the strain of any MHK who has achieved his 70 and 10 years. So the idea that an MHK who can no longer necessarily stay in Tynwald as an MHK for health reasons might get to serve some time as MLC. And Mr. Radcliffe noted the desire of 2 MLCs seeking re-election, quotes, to see one more year in this chamber because of the millennium, end quotes. Leading Mrs. Quayle to note that one of them has given very long and very valuable service to this island. And in my opinion, if he wants one more year, we should give it to him. My feeling is that both of these themes have gone, that we don't see being an MLC as a reward for long service, as something which should be done as part of a phased retirement, and that we don't see the MLCs as being the representative of the Keys against the non-democratic membership of the council, if only for the pragmatic reason that the overwhelming majority of the council are now MLCs elected by the Keys. So I think that is the reason why the MHK MLC feeder has severed. There's also a theme that sometimes it was recognised that it looked really dodgy. It looked like MHKs were doing favours for MHKs by elevating people to the MLC. So there was this sort of pressure to reach outside as well. And my final points are about the women in the Legislative Council. Rather shockingly, women could not be elected to the Legislative Council until 1961. So my table starting in the 60s is from the period at which women could be members. And again, we see it was sometime after the bar was lifted before the first woman was put forward, Betty Hanson, MHK, who was nominated in the 1978 election, and in 1982 went on to be the first woman to be elected as MLC. There were then a small number of women in the 1990s and 2000s, all of whom had experience as MHKs before joining the council. When we get to the 2010s, though, we see things start to change. The appointments, women were appointed to MLC 6 times in the 2010s. The appointments between 2017 and 2020 being equal to the number of women appointed before 2010. Jane Poole Wilson was appointed for a short term in 2017, not having previously sat in Tynwald. In the 2018 contest, which included both her seat and 4 others, 5 women were appointed, with only Poole Wilson having sat in Tynwald previously. So I think increased representation of women in the Legislative Council did not begin until the 1970s, and actually it hadn't been legally possible for very long before that. It gained momentum alongside an erosion of the expectation that you got to be an MLC having been an MHK. If this hadn't been eroded, then because of the relatively low representation of women in the Keys before then, you would have found that as a break on women being elevated to become members of the Legislative Council. There's only been 2 processes since 2020, in the 2020s, again, very small numbers, but a focus on them tentatively suggests that this increase in women being nominated and elected, and in non-MHKs being nominated and elected, is continuing. 50% of the candidates in the 2020 process were women, 81% of the candidates had not previously sat in Tynwald. So it feels to me that there has been a sea change in what the Keys are looking for in a member of the Legislative Council. So I'm just going to come to my conclusions. I think putting the 2021 elections into historical context highlights some useful issues. We've got the shift in council from former MHKs ending their national political career to non-Tynwald members beginning it. And obviously in 2021, we saw 2 MLCs become MHKs. Not entirely unprecedented. First that I found who began their time at Tynwald in the Legislative Council. An increase in women running and being elected as MHKs, and the continued lack of dominance by parties, let alone a 2-party system. Thank you very much.